and welcome to the Marion Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Claire Riva. I'm one of your Athenaeum student fellows this year, and I'm pleased to introduce our guest tonight. First, however, I must remind you that audio-video recording and photography of any kind are prohibited. Tonight, Professor Sheri Berman will give her talk, Social Democracy and the Creation of Modern Europe. She will discuss how Europe went from being one of the most politically and economically tumultuous regions in the 19th century and the early 20th century, and the radical shift that took it to become, in the second half of the 20th century, one of the most stable regions in the world. She will argue that this change comes from social democracy, a regime that is not purely political, as you might expect, but also entails substantial social arrangements. Professor Berman is a professor of political science and the chair of the political science department at Barnard College. She has also taught at Columbia, Princeton, and George Washington universities. She has published 2 books and numerous academic articles, essays, and book chapters. And she has been awarded many fellowships and honors, including an honorary doctorate from the Uppsala University in Sweden. She is on the editorial boards of multiple academic journals, and she chairs the European Politics and Society Division at the American Political Science Association. She received her bachelor's degree in political science from Yale University and her master's and doctorate from Yale in government. Professor Berman's visit tonight is sponsored by the Keck Center for International and Strategic Studies. So clearly we're in good hands. With that, please join me in welcoming Professor Sheri Berman to the Athenaeum.
Well, thank you, Claire, and thank you all for inviting me here. I've had a lovely day getting a chance to see a little bit of your campus and enjoying your lovely weather, so I'll hopefully be able to repay you with a little entertainment. So as you know, I'm going to talk to you today about the creation of modern Europe. And Europe today is kind of back in the news, but not really for very good reasons. We see now a Europe that is kind of marred by instability and confusion. And most of the contemporary focus is on what's going on at the level of the European Union, but in fact, we should see this as part of a larger set of problems that Europe is going through today. And what I want to talk to you about is kind of the backstory to these problems, and in particular, about the decline of the post-war order that helped to bring stability and democratic consolidation to Europe after the Second World War. Now, again, this is a little bit of a strange topic because up until maybe 10 years ago, Europe was really very boring. Nothing really changed very much in Europe. And it would be hard to kind of fill a room, I think, with 80 or 85 people to talk about Europe, especially when there were so many other things going on. But again, we have to really puzzle through. We have to really try to understand what's going on in Europe today. And what I want to remind you is that the decades of stability that we associate with Europe really are a historical anomaly. Before 1945, as Claire mentioned, Europe was the scene of the most tumultuous political change in the world. This was a place where we had 2 world wars, where we had terrible dictatorships, where we had a pretty constant stream of democratic experiments that had been tried and failed. And so what I want to talk to you about is how these things changed, right? So we know about the failures of democracy in places like Germany and Italy. Everybody kind of learns about this. But this is actually a widespread phenomenon. Even in the home of democracy, right, the place where democracy began, modern democracy began, right, we had a constant stream of political transitions. So this is just a sort of list of some of the biggies in French political history, right? But I could go on, which I won't. So this is sort of Spain, for example. We had a big democratic wave in Europe in 1848. Actually, when we talk about the Arab Spring today, people are consciously or unconsciously echoing 1848, springtime of the peoples, right? But this democratic wave, although it swept all across Europe, failed. Not a single one of these democratic experiments actually took place. Then, of course, we had another huge democratic wave in Europe during the interwar years. But most of these democratic experiments failed as well. So the question is, how do we understand the change that happened in Europe after 1945? Why, after 150 years of political instability, of failed democratic experiments. Did democracy actually come to stay, at least in Western Europe, after 1945? So this is really the question that needs to be answered. Political scientists like puzzles. So this is our puzzle, right? Why does democracy work in Western Europe after 1945 when it was unable to do so before 1945? Well, this is obviously a complicated question. It's a big question, right? And there's lots of things that changed, right? Lots of things that changed after 1945 that helped explain this, right? So I'll go through some of the obvious ones, right? So the Second World War got rid of a lot of the sort of social classes that had been the major supports of dictatorship in Europe. This is particularly true in Germany, where the class that was most associated with dictatorships in the past, the Junker class, those kind of big, large landowners, those people were essentially eliminated by the Second World War and then had the unfortunate experience of ending up primarily in East Germany afterwards, where, of course, the communists didn't have any real use for them. Other things that changed as a result of the Second World War, well, nationalism took a big hit, obviously, delegitimized by the crimes of the Nazis and the fascists, right? Also, very important, something that other people don't think that much about, is massive ethnic cleansing that occurred in Europe, both during the Second World War and after the Second World War. Why is this important? Because it created much more homogeneous states ethnically in Europe after 1945. And these states proved much less difficult to manage than their pre-war predecessors. Other things that changed. The role of the US. This is another obvious important factor in Europe's post-war transformation, right? The United States' role in Europe changed after 1945. It occupied Germany, which was obviously the continent's most problematic country. It made a firm commitment to promoting both capitalist development and democracy in Europe after 1945. In fact, so important was the role of the US in determining Europe's post-war fate that one famous Norwegian historian has called the relationship between the US and Europe after 1945, empire by invitation. Obviously, to contrast it with the empire by imposition that happened in the eastern half of the continent. Now, however important these factors were in promoting democratization, without socioeconomic stability, this entire experiment would have collapsed. And this is obvious if you know anything about previous European history, because before the second half of the 20th century, class conflict, and social divisions had been a key reason why democracy had not been able to function in Europe. It had fed extremism, it had fed violence. And this was a key reason, again, why dictatorships arose not just during the interwar period, but before that. Now, the Great Depression, of course, the interwar period in particular, gave a sort of renewed sense to Europeans that these social conflicts, that these class divisions, that these problems, economic problems, really needed to be dealt with forthrightly if democracy was going to work after 1945. So this sense at the end of the Second World War that creating socioeconomic stability was absolutely paramount. This was also made clear by the actual situation that Europe faced after the Second World War. So in 1945, the actual condition of Europe led many people to fear not just for the fate of democracy, but just for, again, social stability overall. Communists were very powerful in Europe immediately after 1945. This was, of course, partially a consequence of the role communist movements had played, resistance movements, during the war. And the continent itself was in such a mess that people feared desperation might once again force or encourage Europeans to turn to extremism. Okay, so the basic point of this is that you really need to understand, if you really want to understand the success of democracy after 1945 in Europe, you really need to understand the differences between the kinds of political economies that Europe had in the pre-45 and post-45 eras. So what I want to talk about today is this change, right? How Europe's political economy was transformed after 1945 in ways that helped to consolidate democracy in Europe. So what emerged from the war in Europe after 1945 was this consensus that I mentioned, right? This consensus that socioeconomic stability absolutely had to be made a priority if Europe was going to rise from the ashes after 1945, if democracy was going to have any chance of success in Europe after the war, right? So what you see in Europe after 1945 is something historically quite anomalous for Europe, which is a consensus across the economic spectrum that governments need to focus their attention on this, on creating socioeconomic stability, on figuring out ways to foster social harmony, to create social peace, and to overcome the social and class conflicts that had helped to scuttle democratic experiments before 1945. So these are just some quotes, perhaps from social scientists, intellectuals that you might be familiar with, again, sort of pointing out this kind of sense, right, that this was really the primary task that European politicians and policymakers faced after 1945. Now, these kinds of views, this sense that overcoming social divisions, dealing with class divisions, dealing with the problems more generally generated by capitalism. This understanding, this focus, had of course been long championed by different groups on the left. But what changed, interestingly enough, after 1945, right, is that it was embraced not just by parties on the left, but again by parties across the political spectrum. So we can see, for example, here some excerpts from the 1947 program of the German Christian Democrats, right? Again, reflecting this sort of sense that this was a priority. Again, the sort of Catholic movement in France, again, if you want to think of it sort of as the center-right party, again, sort of focused on this need to kind of create this new type of order in Western Europe. And again, the understanding of this order was that it had this very particular goal, right? It had to protect societies from capitalism's most destabilizing consequences, right? It had to decisively break with the European past, right? Governments after 1945 would have to focus intently on protecting their societies from the vicissitudes and destructiveness of markets, right? Now this is what I call a social democratic understanding of the relationship between states, markets, and societies. This is a social democratic understanding of what democratic consolidation requires, right? It says that if democracy is going to succeed in Western Europe after 1945, where it has not been able to do so before, then the social conflicts, the social divisions, the social instability that had scuttled democratic experiments previously would have to be confronted head-on. This would have to be made a priority of governments across Western Europe. Now, this happened in a variety of different ways in different European countries. Across the continent, the two big changes, right, although not embraced by everyone, were first, this is also reflecting the fact that even Americans at that time, by the way, thought that this was a good idea. The first kind of thing that we think about as changing after 1945 was Keynesianism, right? An acceptance of Keynesianism by many countries in Europe. Not all, but by many. Now, the reason why Keynesianism is so important is not just for the reasons we heard it bandied about today as a way to sort of deal with depressions, to sort of kickstart markets, but politically, Keynesianism was a very powerful change after 1945, because what it said was states can and should intervene to deal with market failures and protect societies from markets' destructive outcomes. Keynes himself argued very clearly that state action would often be necessary to help avoid the kinds of economic crises that had led to Europe's tragedies during the interwar years, right? Keynes experienced both the rise of the Soviet Union and the rise of Nazi Germany, and he was very powerfully influenced by these events. And he saw in his economic writings and in the policies he put forward ways to avoid these tragedies in the future. He felt very much that governments needed to intervene in capitalism in order to prevent the kind of extremism that led to these terrible outcomes. And he saw his writings in precisely this way. He saw their political impact, not merely their economic impact. He believed that Keynesianism could help undercut the appeal of extremism of both the left and the right, right? He wanted to undercut the left by showing that capitalism could in fact be saved, that to get good outcomes you didn't have to destroy it, you could kind of fix it through government action. And he wanted to undercut support for the right by showing that democracies could actually deal with problems, that you didn't need to have a dictatorship to deal with the kinds of troubles that capitalism can cause. So he wanted to use the state to control the problems or the crises generated by capitalism. The other major transformation, of course, after 1945 in most parts of Europe was the growth of the welfare state, right? This is another quote by a well-known British social scientist, right, saying, look, here's what changed. Here's something important that changed after 45, right? It became accepted that it was the state's function, it was the state's obligation to ward off distress and strain, to take care explicitly of society. Now again, it's important to recognize the political and not merely the economic implications of welfare states, right? Welfare states were important after 1945, not merely because they helped to ward off economic problems for folks who were vulnerable, right? But also welfare states were important because they showed that states were committed to societies. It gave people a sense that they belonged to a national community, and that their states were responsive to them and would protect them in times of distress, right? That the common good was something that states recognized as part of their obligation. Welfare states were thus very clearly a sort of break with the sort of liberal Gesellschaft, for those of you who are inclined towards social theory, right? A way to deal with the sort of atomization, the anomie, the sense of dislocation that had so pervaded European societies up through the interwar period, right? And it was, welfare states were part, again, of a deliberate attempt to kind of undercut the support of anti-democratic ideologies and anti-democratic movements that had played off this sense, again, of societies that were kind of at a loss, of individuals who felt that there was nobody out there to care for them, who felt that they were, again, sort of adrift. And welfare states would respond to this by, again, giving people a sense that they were part of a community and that the state was there to deal with those communities' problems. Okay, so the reshaping of Europe's political economies didn't stop, obviously, with Keynesianism and welfare states. Each individual European country had its own way of kind of adjusting to these post-war needs, right? So in France, for example, just some of the different variations, in France, one of the kind of key features of this new post-war political economy was nationalizations. Again, interestingly enough, accepted on both the right and the left. The idea, again, being that the sources of common wealth needed to be taken over, at least partially, by the state, again, for the good of the community, right? More important even than nationalizations was planning, which became particularly associated with the French model. Again, the idea that the state should help to plan economic development, again, to ensure that it happened in a way that would be good, beneficial for society as a whole. Jean Monnet, who we, again, more often think of in conjunction with European integration, was a key figure here. In Italy, a little bit different story here. In Italy, the post-war economy was much more state-controlled. This, of course, being partially a legacy, of course, of the fascist era, right? But even more important than that, right, again, is the kinds of things we see kind of built into post-war political economies, right? So right there in the post-war Italian Constitution, right, is a commitment to protecting citizens, a commitment to protecting them again from the kinds of problems that had led to the rise of fascism in the 1920s, right? Italian citizens were promised a whole range of benefits, again, as a way to sort of ward them off from that tendency towards extremism, right? A sense that while capitalism was there and was there to generate wealth, it could not again be allowed to override the needs of citizens to a degree that might, again, tempt them to anti-democratic ideologies. In Germany, the picture is a little bit more complicated, of course, because of the reaction to the National Socialist regime, right? So here, because of the legacy of Nazism, there was a very strong sensitivity to too much direct state control of the economy, right? So economic liberalism was a much more important part of the German post-war political economy than it was in other places. But even here, even in a place where the reaction to statism was strongest and the influence of the US most powerful, even here, we got a very clear shift towards a more social market economy, as the Germans call it, right? By the 1950s already, the German state was already absorbing about 35% of GDP in taxes. The state was playing a large role in steering both investment and savings. Half the capital formation in the Federal Republic, for example, was indirectly financed or directly financed by public means. German industry was, of course, highly organized in industrial organizations, and these industrial organizations were seen as having not just an economic, but a public role. They were seen as having public responsibilities. And, of course, the German state made, as did its counterparts in other areas of Western Europe, a commitment to the kinds of social protection that were seen as absolutely necessary to protect citizens from markets, right? To protect citizens from the kinds of traumas and troubles that were seen as having contributed to the rise of Hitler, right? So you saw an expansion of the welfare state in Germany, of course, but also other innovative measures like co-determination, which were designed, again, to bridge social cleavages. Co-determination was a system that brought labor and business leaders explicitly together to make decisions about the way businesses and the economy would run. And again, very explicitly designed to avoid social conflict, to avoid class divisions, to bring different groups together to protect not just the economy, but society from instability. Again, these kinds of things happened all across the board in Western Europe. It went furthest in parts of Scandinavia, which is why political scientists love to study Scandinavia, because it's the place where these developments kind of reached their sort of highest point. But the point to take away, right, is this, right, that what happened in Europe after 1945 was a dramatic shift in political economies, a dramatic shift in the nature of capitalism, right? So much so that some of the most important, some of the most influential observers of post-war European capitalism thought that the system had almost changed beyond recognition. Again, if you compare it to what existed early in the 20th or late in the 19th century, right? Capitalism, of course, remained in Europe. There was no end of capitalism, right, as many or some on the left had hoped. But the capitalism that grew after 1945 in Europe was a very different type of capitalism than that which had existed before, right? It was a capitalism that was very explicitly limited by states, very explicitly affected by political power, and very clearly supposed to be made, if not subservient to social goals and needs, at least compatible with them, right? Now this, of course, is not what people on the far left had hoped, Marxists and communists who hoped that, of course, capitalism would end with the end of the Second World War. right? But it was also very different from what liberals had hoped for, right? Who had wanted a more forthright restoration of free markets after 1945. You had something that was sort of in between. And what's so amazing, again, from the perspective of the time, because no one really expected it, was how well this order actually worked, right? The growth that Western Europe experienced after 1945 was by far its most impressive period of growth since the transition to capitalism in the 18th or the 19th century, right? And this was not what people expected in 1945. When a poll was done, for example, in the American zone of occupied Germany after 1945, people expected it to take at least 20 years for Germany to recover to the point it was before the war. These were Germans surveyed in about 1947. When they were asked how long until Germany recovers its pre-war economic position, they guessed it would be 20 years. At about the same time, de Gaulle had informed the French that it would take about 25 years of furious work for France to get back on its feet again. There was still a sense in this period, again, a few years after the war, that Europe was still very much on the precipice, and that it would take maybe 20 years, a generation, to get it back on its feet again. But again, we know that that's not what happened at all. This order was remarkably successful. This is, for instance, Germany, right, the most important country, right? It was the best period of growth that Europe had experienced in its entire history, those sort of 20 or 30 years after 1945. And this economic success had incredibly powerful political ramifications, right? What this success of this capitalism did was it helped to solidify support for democracy, right? It helped to solidify support for democracies that were now overseeing a capitalism that was not just successful in generating growth, but successful in spreading its benefits much more widely and much more equally than ever before, right? So unlike the periods during the war, the interwar years, or before, you did not see a Europe rocked by massive strikes, rocked by street fighting, rocked by people constantly out on the streets protesting government, et cetera, et cetera. This was a period, again, historically, of incredible social calm for Europe. Compromises that people never thought were possible before became routine during these post-war years, right? No longer was capitalism perceived as being a zero-sum game in Europe, right? Capitalism now, all of a sudden, seemed to have something to offer to everyone, right? Workers were benefiting, capitalists were benefiting, businesses were benefiting, labor unions became less radical, employers became less eager to sort of fight with workers and more willing to give them some of the benefits of the growth that they were experiencing. Here's a quote from a well-known social scientist about how this post-war economic order helped to change sort of the political dynamic in Europe, right? What happened, again, that was so important from his perspective, right, was that economic battles or economic policy decisions no longer seemed zero-sum. There was a sense that everyone could benefit if the game was played correctly, right? You were no longer fighting over fundamentals, you were simply fighting over how to distribute parts of a growing pie. And this changed the dynamics of politics in Europe in profound ways, right? Decline of extremism after 1945, right? As I mentioned, after 45, immediately after 1945, folks were particularly concerned about the appeal of communism. Communist parties didn't disappear in Europe after 1945, but they became much less extreme. Their commitments to democracy solidified, and the support for them generally diminished over time. Extreme right-wing parties also essentially disappeared in Europe, a major, major change from the pre-war, pre-1945 period, right? The decline of extremism on both the left and the right. Also interesting, though, no resurrection of liberalism after 1945. Liberal parties not a major player in European politics after 1945, but more importantly, liberalism as a political philosophy also didn't have much attraction for folks in Europe after 1945. What you had in Western Europe after 1945, in contrast to what you had before, were party systems, right, that were centrifugal rather than centripetal. So for those scientists in the room, and I know there are some, right, rather than having party systems, which were standard in Western Europe, where they were pulled to the extremes, right, there were extremes on both the left and the right, and so the party systems were constantly stressed in that direction. Now you had party systems where the pressure was towards the middle, right? The big competition was no longer between the extremes, but between parties of the center left and the center right. Parties of the center left that were considered social democrats, they called themselves socialists, they called themselves labor, whatever, and on the center right, oftentimes Christian Democrats, right? Extremism essentially disappeared from Western Europe. This was a dramatic change from what had existed before, when these were the parties that often set the tenor for political debate in Western Europe, not just during the interwar years, but during the late 19th and early 20th centuries as well. So what did we see? We saw this huge transformation after 1945, this major transformation of Western Europe's political economy. Its parties changed, its labor movement changed, its business groups and organizations changed, the relationships between states and markets changed, right? This change in political economy is perhaps the most important piece of the puzzle in explaining why Western Europe achieved democratic consolidation after 1945 and not before. Those other reasons, also very important, but this one cannot be overlooked and was perhaps the most important of the bunch. Okay, so let me see if I can sort of sum up this sort of super swift discussion of the post-war order, right? We tend to take today, I think, or at least up until recently, we tended to take sort of democratic stability in Europe for granted, right? We never really thought that this was a part of the world where we had to worry about the stability of democracy, the future of democracy. But again, even with the problems that Europe is having today, we have to recognize how historically anomalous this is. Before 1945, democracy was not something one associated with Western Europe. The longest-lived democracy that existed, real democracy, was the French Third Republic, and even that would probably not have been considered fully consolidated by most political scientists today. The story of Europe up through the Second World War is a story of political instability. It's a story of a continent that had been torn by political instability, by political extremism, by constant social and ethnic conflict. Democratic experiments there had been many of, but almost all of them failed, and often failed in pretty spectacular and violent ways. The silver lining of the biggest failure of them all, that is to say the failures of the interwar years, was that after this terrible tragedy that Europe experienced in the 20s and 30s and 40s, people came out of that with a sense that if democracy was finally going to work in Europe, then things really needed to change, right? Really needed to change if consolidation was actually going to be something that Europe experienced. And this is what I wanted to sort of stress to you today, right? This consensus that emerged in Europe after 1945, that for democracy to work, not just institutions would change, not just political leadership would change, but the relationship between states and markets and society would have to change as well. That for democratic consolidation to actually happen, economic reform and social reform were every bit as important as political reform. This, I wanted to argue, going back to the sort of title of the talk, this is what the sort of significance of the term social democracy is in this context, right? The form of democracy that finally worked in Europe after 1945 was what I think is best termed social democracy. Now, sometimes this order, for those of you who maybe have studied this period a little bit well, is often referred to as a time of embedded liberalism. This is the most common term that's used to describe the post-war order in Western Europe. I don't think this is actually a very good term because I don't actually think there was anything very liberal about this order at all. Why I think this should be recognized as social democracy is because, again, of this changed understanding of the relationship between states and markets and society. This emphasis on the need to promote and protect social stability and avoid social conflict. This was a position that social democrats on the left had long championed. But what changed after 1945 was that it was no longer these folks, these reformers on the left who recognized this, but many people on different parts of the political spectrum as well. Now, I think a lot of Europeans, when you talk to them about this, they still sort of understand what the significance of this post-war order was, right? They know that what their history looked like before 1945, and they know that the accomplishments after 1945 are ones that are really historically unprecedented and that, that they can justly be proud of, right? And so when we look at Europe as Americans today and we see these kinds of crazy attachments to welfare states and this incredible sense that sort of social provision is so important, sometimes as Americans we look at this and we think, what's the matter with these people? Are they lazy? Do they not want to work? Why do they rely on their government so much? And that's a silly, misplaced, historically inaccurate way of looking at these things, because these things are largely a product of a particular political development experience. They are a product of a terrible history of democratic failure and a recognition that if these social conflicts and divisions, if the problems of capitalism were not dealt with forthrightly, that democratic consolidation probably would not have worked in Western Europe, even given all of those other things that changed after 1945. Now, when a new democratic wave swept across the world at the sort of end of the 20th century, and now, once again, in some places, in the beginning of the 21st, I think a lot of people haven't really understood what the significance of this European experience is. They don't really understand what the lessons that Europe can teach other parts of the world about democratic consolidation really are. In the United States, I think this is partially because we have a sort of simplistic reading of our own past. I kind of mentioned this in a brief conversation with some of your students before. We don't recognize, because we've had what we think of as a democracy for our entire history, we don't recognize how hard it is to actually make democracy work. Although our own history, if we thought about it a little bit more carefully, would show that in order to even begin to bring democracy to all of our citizens, we had to fight our most bloody war to date. And even then, our state wasn't willing or able to bring democratic rights to all of its citizens. So even though we've had a democracy on paper our entire history, it really wasn't until the second half of the 20th century that it was actually a democracy for all of our citizens. So I think maybe by looking at this European experience, we actually can sort of get some sense of the kinds of challenges and solutions that countries that are going through this incredibly tumultuous process of political development today could actually learn. So let me talk about what I think some of the implications of this are. Well, political scientists like to talk about democracy, and they talk about democracy in two ways. So one definition of democracy is the electoral definition of democracy, right? That's democracy means, okay, you have democratic elections, and as long as you have democratic elections and they're relatively free and fair, that's what democracy is. So if you have those, you're all good. Other political scientists think, you know what, that's too narrow a definition, because you can have elections, they can be relatively free and fair, but sometimes those elections give you really nasty outcomes. Let's say they give you governments that don't want to protect the rights of minorities or trample over the rights of citizens in some other way. So another definition of democracy that political scientists came up with was this second definition, this liberal definition of democracy. And that says democracy only exists when you not only have free and fair elections, but governments are committed to protecting certain rights that we associate with liberalism. These are the kinds of things that we think about in our Bill of Rights, for example. The social democracy that developed in Europe after 1945 goes beyond both of these definitions of democracy. It includes not just free and fair elections. Okay, you got to have those if you want to be considered a real democracy. It also goes beyond the liberal definition of democracy. It's not enough, although it's important, to protect sort of liberal rights. Social democracy says that you have to ensure certain social and economic rights as well. Social democracy, again, as it developed in Europe after 1945, was based on a recognition that if democracy was going to work, the state must take some responsibility for heading off the kinds of social divisions and conflicts that can lead to extremism. And it also has to work to promote a sense of community and legitimacy that are absolutely essential for a well-functioning democratic system. Okay, so I think we can also imagine beyond electoral and liberal democracy a type of democracy called a social democracy, which again incorporates these kinds of social and economic rights into it. And this, I think, has a lot more relevance to some of the problems that countries are having today than a more American version of democracy does. Again, as I sort of have stressed, and as those of you who know something about European history know, what we saw in Europe before 1945, again, was how all of these pressures generated by capitalism, inequality, social divisions, class conflict, how these things helped scuttle democratic experiments, right? And because of this, before 1945, again, most people didn't think that democracy and capitalism could actually go together, right? Marxists didn't think democracy and capitalism could go together, right? Because they thought that if you had democracy, people would vote to eliminate capitalism. Right? And liberals actually felt the same thing. They felt, oh my God, we can't have democracy because workers and the poor will vote in all kinds of policies that'll hurt or hinder private property. And in fact, before 1945, the empirical evidence was on the side of these people. That is to say that democracy and capitalism couldn't go together. But what we saw after 1945 was that a certain form of capitalism was in fact perfectly compatible with democracy. There's a fairly long tradition in political science, in any case, of people trying to think about the relationship between capitalism and democracy, and in particular trying to think about how some of the social problems generated by capitalism can hinder democracy. The sort of granddaddy of this being a book by a man called Samuel Huntington, who was one of Professor Pay's advisors in graduate school, called Political Order and Changing Society. Other scholars who I've mentioned here, again, have also tried to puzzle through how things like equality and different distributions of property, how they can affect the prospects for democracy. But what's interesting is that if you look at magazines and journals today, given the current economic crisis, you have started to see once again fairly mainstream scholars like Wolfgang Streeck or Francis Fukuyama, who I believe you had here, talking once again about the potential, if not incompatibilities between capitalism and democracy, then the tensions between them. So I don't know what Professor Fukuyama talked to you about, but he's been writing a lot, for instance, recently about how the decline of the middle class and how rising inequality threatens the quality and functioning of democracy in the United States. These, again, are questions that people have begun to return to. And by the way, people like Streeck and Fukuyama are not on the extremes. These are pretty mainstream scholars, again, trying to get us to think about these tensions and potential incompatibilities. In places where these kinds of processes are going on today, Thailand, India, China, questions about how to deal with the social divisions generated by capitalism are absolutely central to political discussion and to the political future of these countries, right? How are you supposed to deal with a society that is changing so rapidly, where there are growing divisions between poor and rich, between rural and urban, right? These kinds of divisions, if not dealt with forthrightly, lead to extremism and social instability. This was true in Europe. It's true in many developing countries today. And I think what the European experience shows us is that for many of these countries, right, having to deal with these problems forthrightly is an absolutely necessary prerequisite for political stability in general, but certainly for successful democracy as well. And that the sort of social democracy that developed in Europe after 1945, for all its problems, may actually be more relevant for developing countries today than the type of democracy that we have here in the United States, where social and economic issues are shunted off to the side and not seen as central to the state's role. So I'll stop there. And
we will now be taking questions. As usual, preference will go to students and faculty.
Hi, I'm Nancy from CMC, and I actually want to ask a question about what's your thoughts about social democracy, this idea applied to post-communism countries such as Russia and China? Thank you.
well, may I ask for a little clarification? Is the question about the relevance of this, or?
The relevance and how that could be, like, what's the possibility that it could be applied to the countries? And yeah.
Well, I mean, in general, the model simply says that you need to deal forthrightly with social and class divisions, and that governments should think about ways to deal with that if they want to improve the quality and the functioning of democracy. So in theory, this is not a particularly West European model, right? It looked a particular way in Western Europe, but the idea of social democracy certainly in this sense could be transferred anywhere. The more specific question may be one that you're getting out of government capacity or willingness, right? There's where the more interesting questions of practical implications lie, right? The question is whether governments are interested in dealing with these problems. Most people don't consider Russia to be a real democracy anymore, and there's certainly vast inequalities in Russia, and it's certainly hard for me to imagine, although I can defer to others on this, that you could have a really well-functioning democracy in a place like Russia without dealing forthrightly with these inequalities and with the economic dynamics that underpin them. So again, in the broader sense, I would say that this is something that's absolutely applicable anywhere, particularly to developing countries and new democracies. Whether governments have the desire or the ability to actually implement some of these policies is a different and more difficult question.
Hi, thanks for coming. In what ways in the United States do you think laissez-faire and libertarian ideology come into conflict with democratic functioning?
That's a good question. Well, I mean, in the abstract, they don't have to, right? Because libertarianism wants a government that leaves you alone as much as possible. The question is what happens when you have situations where there's things like rising inequality or social conflict. Then you have a dilemma if you're a libertarian, right? Because you can either let those things go in the hopes either that they'll kind of resolve themselves or it's other people's problems and you don't care about them, or you're faced with the choice of having governments deal with them. Because honestly, these kinds of deep problems are not really very well dealt with generally by civil society. They really require governments to deal with them. Now, governments don't always deal with them successfully, but they are the only game in town when you're dealing with things like massive social inequality or significant social conflicts and divisions. So libertarianism doesn't either see those problems generally or believes that the cure is worse than the disease. That is to say, by giving governments the power and legitimacy to do these kinds of things, you're threatening your freedom to such a degree as to make this not worthwhile. And to some degree, this is really a basic question of political philosophy. It's what you think of as ultimately how you envision freedom. For a social democrat, it's difficult to imagine being free in a country where social inequalities determine, for example, so much of your life chances. For libertarians, they're not bothered by this kind of thing, and so that's not a problem. They see freedom as freedom from rather than freedom to some degree. So, I mean, to some degree, a libertarian and a social democratic view of democracy are really pretty dramatically at odds.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting talk. I had a couple of sort of intertwined questions. Wondered what you thought about them. First is kind of a chicken and the egg question. I'm thinking particularly of Friedman's book on the moral consequences of economic growth. To what degree do you think the massive economic growth of Europe coming out of 1945 made possible this kind of coming together and collaborative political social model? And to what degree do you think it was the political social model that allowed the economic growth? And the other one is sort of a split between the Anglo-American experience, or if you go earlier in history, Dutch Anglo-American experience, where you had a society that either was or perceived to be overwhelmingly bourgeois or very fluid in its political and economic classes, that were more, if you will, libertarian or at least classically liberal, and didn't confront these in this social democratic way. Do you think that different historical experience has implications for how different kinds of developing countries with different kinds of social structures might see these two models as being applicable or not applicable to them?
Thanks. Okay, so the chicken and the egg question. I mean, this is a little difficult to answer, although there is a significant amount of empirical research on it. Generally, the consensus is that this model was incredibly effective for about the 30 years after 1945, so that the model helped to sustain and generate the economic growth. But there is still, even saying that, a bit of a chicken and an egg thing, because the growth itself served to legitimize the model. But there's some great work by folks like Barry Eichengreen showing how much the model contributed to the growth itself. Now, part of that contribution I already mentioned, simply by helping to eliminate social conflict and encourage cooperation between business and labor, it helped to sort of set the social and political foundation upon which economic growth could occur. But more beyond that, there's a lot of work that shows that this kind of political economy was particularly well suited to the economic challenges Europe faced after 1945. It was less well suited to the type of challenges it faced at the end of the 20th century. So the evidence is very much on the side of the model helping to generate the growth, with the growth then helping to solidify or legitimize the model. The second question you ask, I mean, this is a difficult question. I mean, the evidence on social mobility in both the United States and Europe is actually very clear now. Social mobility has declined dramatically in the US, and in fact is now less in the United States than it is in many of the classic social democracies of Europe. So the countries where social mobility is highest actually tend to be the ones that we often associate with social democracy, Scandinavian countries, for example. Now, this, I think, has dramatic implications for how we think about democracy. I mean, inequality in the US has always been justified by saying, yes, we have a more unequal society, but we have a freer society, one where, for example, it's much easier to rise from below to above. And so we could justify inequality because the person who's rich tomorrow may not be the person who's rich today may not be the person who's rich tomorrow. Your father is poor, your mother is poor, but tomorrow you can be rich. That's not so true in the US anymore. And so it makes justifying our political economy more difficult, and the implications for democracy are pretty profound, because while I think people in this country are first waking up to this inequality, the more it hardens generationally, the more profound the political consequences are going to be for our democracy. And so I think this is something that we really will have to worry about if it doesn't change. And I think the implications are not just economic, but profoundly social and political as well.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking to us today. I had a question that you talked about the different political and social developments and movements in Europe, and you left us with a small question at the end of the presentation. And I would like you to give your opinion, if you could. What do you think is going to happen with all these tensions between capitalism and democracy in Europe? Do you think we're going to witness the creation of a new model, of a new political model, of a new political movement? And how is this the economic conflict in the Eurozone going to affect the first of all, Europe and then the whole world? Thanks.
Well, I really, really wish I had a snappy two-sentence answer to that, but I don't. I'm not very good at prognostication. I think my guesses are probably not that much more valuable than anybody else's. That said, I'll give you one anyway. So I think what you're seeing today, obviously, is major problems in Europe, major problems that are caused by the economic crisis that are highlighting flaws in the European system, both at the domestic level and at the European level. So again, as I sort of mentioned at the very beginning, the flaws that we see most often talked about today, the ones that are in the newspaper, are in the European Union, right, which clearly had flaws that the economic crisis has highlighted. But it's also highlighted flaws in this domestic model, right, which has become solidified in many European countries after 1945, and those countries where the model has not changed very much, where you have a model that looks more or less similar to the way it looked in 1960, let's say, or 1970, when European economies were dramatically different than they were today, those are the countries that are having the most severe economic problems. So the Europeans that have taken this social democratic model and have updated it, those are the countries that have done best. Scandinavian countries, to some degree Germany. And I think what you're seeing now is a real crisis for this model because it has been so absolutely central to Europe's success after the post-war period, that if it cannot be reformed, I think you're going to see increasing social conflict in Europe. I think you're going to see increasing support for populist right-wing parties, which have to a large degree captured this issue, that is to say, fed off most successfully the frustration of Europeans with economic stagnation, with social problems. And I think if this is not dealt with forthrightly, if this political economy model can't be regenerated, then I think you're going to see some very serious political problems for European countries down the road, in addition to the issues at the European Union level, which are related but somewhat different.
Hi. I recently read a paper which talked about how social groups basically formed between World War I and World War II in Germany, and how that led to the rise of Hitler, because there were these social groups, and that facilitated his rise. And so basically, I was wondering on the current status of social groups in Europe and how they have any consequences today.
Were there particular types of social groups that you were interested in?
These were basically like cultural groups which were formed by the people to give them strength because they didn't believe in their government at the time. And so I was wondering whether such groups exist today and their role.
I see. Well, you see an interesting dynamic in Europe today, right? You see, again, large numbers of people out on the street. So I'm sure everybody's seen pictures of, tens of thousands of folks out in Spain, in France, in Greece. And this is fed by a sense that their governments are not responding to their problems. And it's fed a sense of rising illegitimacy in Europe, right? And I think you tend to see this kind of trade-off a lot, not just in Europe, but in other parts of the world. Times when governments are not seen as either willing or able to respond to problems, you see people, civil society, right, begin to grow as a kind of response to government inaction or inefficiency. So you're not facing the kind of crisis in Europe today that you had in the 30s, partially because the system is not completely broken down. But when you see tens of thousands of people out on the street, even if peaceful, right, you know that that's a warning sign, right? And when people begin to think that the way to solve problems is no longer through politics, right, political disillusionment. We see this, by the way, on both the right and the left in the United States, right? So Ron Paul supporters on the right, but the Occupy Wall Street folks who no longer believe that change can come through traditional political means, this is a very sad thing for democracy, right? And so when you see stuff like this in Europe, not just people out on the streets, but people who have lost faith in their governments, who no longer believe that their governments are willing or able to respond to them, this is very, very dangerous. Not dangerous in the 1930s sense, but dangerous nonetheless, right? It's a sense that people feel that democracy is not really working for them anymore. And that, again, tends to lead to all kinds of nasty things. In Europe, the real threat is from right-wing populism, but more generally from political disillusionment.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful talk. I wanted to get back to a point that you made earlier in the speech about the homogeneity of Europe and how that contributed to the social stabilization. Given a lot of the things we're seeing in Europe and towards the trends and controversies, for example, in Germany, the rise of immigration, especially amongst the Turkish population, and how that's contributing to ethnic strife there. Also in Norway, the shooter was primarily a reactionary towards the rise of Islam as well. I was wondering how you, I know you don't like to prognosticate, but where you see the trend in this kind of ethnic diversity in Europe going, and how you best, how you would like the European governments to respond to that tension.
Good, great questions. I think there's no doubt that the relative ethnic homogeneity of Europe after 1945 facilitated a lot of the positive things that happened. And I don't mean that in a normative sense, like I think the homogeneity was good. I think what it did was lessen the load on governments. So this was one less challenge that they had to deal with. I think what immigration has done is it has created, again, new social divisions and conflicts in European societies. Now, these are generally healthy, right? Europe needs immigration, not for purely demographic reasons, although it needs it for that, but also because this is a global world and it's really hard to survive if you don't have, you know, contact with it. But this is a real challenge for European societies because this is relatively new for some of them, not for others. Places like France have long had immigrants. But this is relatively new. I mentioned to some of the folks I spoke to, I first went to Sweden about 25 or 30 years ago. I was what passed for ethnic diversity when I went to Sweden 25 years ago. When I go back to Sweden now, 1 out of every 8 Swedes has a foreign-born parent. That's a generation of change that we really can't imagine. Now, this is a real social challenge, and this is a real social challenge for this social democratic model alongside the challenges that we all talk about from things like globalization. Why? Because this model was built on a sense of community, right? That it was the state's responsibility to take care of its citizens, and they were all in this together. You pay your taxes because someday those benefits could be yours. Someday you might need that particular social program. It's harder to do that when you don't feel as strong a kinship with the other people in your society. This is a challenge that European governments really need to confront better. They need to figure out ways to bring people together, to assimilate immigrants better, and to avoid the right, in particular, from monopolizing this issue, which it has for way too long. This is an issue that the left for too long in Europe shied away from. It either didn't want to deal with because it was really touchy, or it dealt with it in the most superficial way by saying, look, multiculturalism is great, and everybody should be who they want, and we don't need to worry about that because, you know, things will take care of itself. That's not right. And so what happened was, because the left didn't have a good way of addressing these issues, the right in Europe has really been the part of the political spectrum that has been most vociferous in dealing with these issues. And this is a major problem for European politics and for this kind of model, because without that sort of sense of community, it's very difficult to perpetuate this model over the long term.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Among the things you said that changed after 1945 was the role of the U.S. in Europe. And while you didn't refer to it specifically, I was wondering, in your opinion, how much weight you would attribute to the Marshall Plan in fostering or creating an environment in which social democracy could blossom?
So I think the best way to think about the Marshall Plan is not just as a particular policy, but as part of this larger commitment that the U.S. made to ensuring the success of both capitalism and democracy after 1945. So the Marshall Plan was sort of a specific policy, right? Okay, look, there's this balance of payments problem. Europe needs money. We got to get them some money. But it was envisioned as part of this larger set of measures to help Europe get on its feet. And as you, I'm guessing, know, since you asked, the Marshall Plan was also, for instance, tied to the other thing that we've been sort of talking about, which is European integration. The idea was that this was part of helping to regenerate Europe, helping to get Europe kind of to take its fate in its own hands and to come together to try to deal with the common problems that it faced. So absolutely, the Marshall Plan in particular, but American support for Europe, not just financial through the Marshall Plan, but through a wide range of multilateral institutions that help tie Europe together and tie it to the U.S., was absolutely, absolutely central. But again, has to be seen as part of this post-war consensus. The Americans understood, again, I flashed through that slide because I didn't want to waste too much time. Americans understood after 1945 in a way they don't really understand today, this issue of socioeconomic stability, and that capitalism had to work in Europe, not just because we as Americans like capitalism, but because if we didn't get growth and if we weren't able to overcome these social problems, that communism in particular would increase in support for communism would increase, and this whole sort of idea of solidifying Western Europe in the American camp would come under threat.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. My question is, if you look at the European model and the American model, both models are under incredible strains nowadays. And one possible reason may be the rise of global capitalism, otherwise known as globalization. Which model do you believe is perhaps more capable of adjusting to the challenge of global capitalism?
Mm-hmm. So I think both models have their pluses and minuses, and both have their rigidities. The European model is a varied model, right? So there's different versions of the European model. So some countries have proven very unwilling or unable to adjust and still have policies in place that are suited for a capitalism of the 1970s rather than the 2010s. Other countries have done remarkably well. So, you know, if you look at global competitiveness rankings, which I'm sure you do, the Scandinavian countries, for instance, often come out on top. And it's not just the Scandinavian countries, because it's always easy to say, oh, those 5 million Danes or those 9 million Swedes, they're so smart. So I think you can do it either way. I don't think one model is necessarily better at dealing with globalization than another, but they deal with it in different ways. Again, the social democratic model says one must adjust to capitalism, but one must do that with a recognition of its social consequences. The American model is, okay, let's sort of be open, but let's let the chips fall where they will. And I think what we've seen is that that's worked increasingly less well in the United States over the last 20 years. You could have made a stronger case for that, I think, in the 70s than, again, you can today, when the chips are falling in ways that look increasingly problematic from a social and a political perspective.
Thank you. You've pointed out how this social democratic model has been applied throughout Europe and has helped lead to stability and economic growth. And you pointed out how it's not working as well in some countries anymore. And you pointed out how Scandinavian countries and Germany have reformed theirs along the way, and so have adopted and have done very well as a result. But how should these models be reformed in the rest of Europe? Thank you.
I think, as with so many of these things, we could design in the abstract a good model. The hindrances are political rather than economic. So if you were to look at the kinds of things that exist in the more successful European countries, these are not countries with smaller welfare states, let's say, or less social expenditures. They're countries whose social expenditures are devoted to helping people adjust to changing economic conditions rather than avoid them. The problem in a lot of places is not that we don't know what works, it's that there's politically entrenched interests that make it very difficult to shift policies. So in the abstract, we know what we should have. We should have unemployment policies that don't pay people to stay at home, that pay them to retrain. We shouldn't have pensions like we have in the United States, or health care that we have in the United States that's tied to jobs, that therefore makes workers incredibly intent on keeping a particular job rather than being able to switch jobs. We should have policies that help all workers move if they need to work. We should have policies that encourage education for all and not just for the wealthy. Things, again, that help people adjust rather than just cater to keeping in a middle-class lifestyle some relatively privileged part of the working class. The problem in places like Greece and Italy is not that we don't know what would be an improvement, it's that it's very difficult to reform things where there are entrenched interests. We know what the problems, for instance, with the Greek economy are. The problem is that it's politically almost impossible to change them. So I think we can imagine what the correct model looks like in the abstract. It looks more Scandinavian than it does Southern European. The hindrances really are figuring out how to move from one to the other, and those hindrances, I think, are really political rather than economic. That doesn't make them any less difficult to overcome. In fact, it makes them more difficult to overcome. But the problem is one of politics, not of not knowing what economic policies work.
I appreciate your address tonight for many reasons. I'd like to ask a question which perhaps can enlighten some of the theories, and let me put it in this fashion. Homogeneity, especially in Western European peoples, appears to have been an essential element to the advances after 1945, in contrast to the heterogeneity which prevailed sometime prior to that. In North America, there are a number of societies, we speak of them as Native Americans, in which homogeneity is a very essential part of continuity of tribal nations. And in these tribal nations, particularly the larger ones, such as the Dene, Apaches, and others in western states, the governmental arrangements are explicitly set up to deal with the needs of the tribe, of the people, in ways beyond which individuals can address those own needs. So the government does exactly what you're saying needs to happen for a social society. Here is a homogeneous society. What do we learn from the ways in which American Indians govern themselves within the constraints of a bigger overriding government which constrains what they can do? How do we get, does that take us to a different understanding of social democracy in a smaller representative nation?
That's a toughie. I don't know that much about Indian, Native American self-government. I don't know. I mean, I think that if I understand the core of your question, about the sort of the role of homogeneity in social democracy. And I think this question was asked in another way just a little bit earlier. I think there's simply no doubt that these kinds of policies are much easier to affect in homogeneous societies. And the reason for that is the stronger the sense of kinship, the more easy it is to ask people to sacrifice for one another. So I think that that's a factor that cannot be overlooked. I don't think it's an insurmountable obstacle, but it certainly facilitates this kind of democracy, a social democracy, that is to say, is easier in a society that is homogeneous, although that homogeneity can be defined in a variety of different ways. In other words, some societies are homogeneous by religion, some societies may be homogeneous linguistically, some societies may be homogeneous in other ways. So homogeneity is in of itself a sort of an ambiguous term, but I think the stronger the sense of kinship, the easier it is to affect these kinds of policies. I don't think, again, that we can say that there's a hindrance, but all things being equal, those kind of situations are easier. That's one of the reasons, besides globalization, why this model has run into trouble in Europe during the late 20th century, because the degree of social change demographically or population-wise in Europe is really very, very dramatic. Societies, again, like the Scandinavians ones, that had never before had significant immigration except from Finns, which, although they feel themselves very different, I can tell you, are not as different from Scandinavia, from Swedes as they like to think of themselves as being. This is a dramatic social challenge, right? Incorporating into your society people with very different backgrounds, histories, cultures, that is a real challenge. And so that is something that Europeans have had to struggle with, and it is something that has hurt that social democratic model or made it more difficult. It's not insurmountable, but it is a challenge, I think, that needs to be faced forthrightly.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have this evening. Please join me in thanking Professor Sheri Berman for her talk.